Welcome to Chapter 4, Peripheral Sensory Systems and Monitoring Movement. In this chapter, we're going to discuss a little bit about how the peripheral and sensory motor systems are responsible for monitoring movement and how this relates to reflexes in the central nervous system. Emphasis will be placed on the proprioceptive and visual sensory systems. We'll begin the chapter by talking specifically about that, the sensory systems and the receptors, and how those receptors relate to body awareness, proprioception, and reflexes. Then we'll refresh your memory about the muscle spindles and the stretch reflex. We'll take a closer look at the vestibular system and the visual system. And we'll conclude this chapter by discussing the sensory and motor integration and the dorsal stream movement control. Movement planning, initiation, and execution cannot run smoothly or effectively unless information regarding the actual movement is relayed back to the central nervous system. Without this information, the CNS cannot monitor ongoing movements for the purpose of making adjustments or evaluate movement effectiveness after the fact for the purpose of learning and future movement planning. The sensory division of the peripheral nervous system is responsible for this movement monitoring and relaying information back to the central nervous system. The receptors in the peripheral nervous system transmit the signal to the CNS, which then routes the signal back out to the periphery for action. The sensory system, though, is also responsible for initiating reflex movements that don't require participation from the brain. These reflexes occur without consciousness and are not considered goal-directed movements, or what are referred to as motor skills. This type of control is a closed-loop control without conscious awareness. Reflexes are typically stereotyped and repeatable motor actions and caused by stimulation of sensory receptors. Muscles are found at the distal ends of motor neurons, but sensory neurons have a sensory ending called a receptor that feeds back into the central nervous system. In this slide, you'll see an example of different kinds of sensory receptors that are specially designed to detect stimuli from their environment and translate that stimuli into electrical signals. The role of the receptor is to translate the stimuli from the environment into the electrical signals that the nervous system can understand. The classification schemes for the receptors include different types of stimulus depending on their location and their functionality. The types of stimulus and receptors that we will be talking about and we saw in the previous video include mechanical receptors, thermoreceptors, nociceptors, and so forth. The location in the body determines the type of receptor that we would see. Interoceptors and visceral receptors are more internal. Visceral refers to the body's internal organs, like the bowel, which has receptors that sense being stretched, as opposed to the somatic receptors of the skin, which are sensitive to other stimuli, like light touch. Exteroreceptors are also seen in the external portions of the body, the receptors responding to stimuli that initiate outside of the body. So we're talking about very close to the surface of the skin. And finally, the proprioceptors are found in muscles, tendons, and joints. Proprioceptors are sensory receptors commonly found in those places as well as the inner ear, and their job is to detect the motion or the position of the body or limb by responding to stimuli within the organism. When a proprioceptor is disturbed by some kind of mechanical stimulus, it forms an action potential. And that action potential is sent along its sensory neuron to the spinal cord. That basic reflex arc that's generated is illustrated by a stretch reflex. And the arc includes sensory endings, a sensory neuron, central information processing area, such as the spinal cord, a motor neuron, and an effector organ. In the next video, in the next slide, we're going to learn a little bit more about the reflex arc.
Okay, in this tutorial I'm going to talk about what a reflex arc is. So let's get straight into it. Alright, a reflex arc. So, a reflex arc, it's kind of what we've been looking at already, but there's a slight difference. So essentially, let's come back to our model before of how we respond or sense things. So firstly, for instance, if our hand is pushed on a pin, we'll have pain receptors. We'll send a message via a sensory neuron, step 2. So the message, an electrical impulse, gets sent down the sensory neuron and into, now this is a section of the spinal cord. So you've got a section of the spine here. And inside the spinal cord is an interneuron or a relay neuron, which essentially passes that message up to the brain. Right? And then a message gets passed on to a motor neuron. So you see here the cell body within the spinal cord, and an impulse will travel down here until it reaches some sort of effector, like our muscle. So reflex arc, a reflex action, or a reflex arc is essentially when we respond to something really quickly and in a kind of an involuntary way. And these things ensure that we don't cause any further damage to our body. So a reflex arc is a really quick response where we don't even have time to think about it. Our body responds before we even think about it. So what's different about a reflex arc and the regular types of response or the regular types of neural pathways we've been looking at so far? Well, the real difference is simply this. The stimulus sends a signal via the sensory neuron, and when it reaches the interneuron, this relay neuron here, rather than waiting for a signal to go up to the brain and a signal to come back down from the brain, so rather than stopping and thinking about it, sending signals up to the brain and back down again, essentially a message gets passed straight onto the motor neuron. So here the electrical impulse goes through the sensory neuron, through the interneuron, and goes straight into the motor neuron. So it bypasses the brain. And this essentially means the response happens before we even know it. Alright, so before the signal has even reached up in the brain, or we have any chance to actually respond, we've already sent a signal out to the muscles to make us move. And this really just ensures that we don't waste any time thinking about what needs to happen when we really need to just respond quickly. So if we put our hand on a pin or on something hot, like in a fire or something, what's going to happen is the signal is going to go, so a strong stimulus that kind of often is a sign that something's causing us damage, is going to send a strong signal down this the sensory neuron, and it's going to go straight through the interneuron, bypassing the brain is the key bit, straight out the motor neuron, and going to make our muscle kind of spasm or move away from whatever's causing it damaged. And so these are kind of pre-programmed or connected so that essentially it will result in a movement away from whatever's causing us damage. So if you touch something with the open side of your hand and it burns you, it'll make your arm pull away essentially to prevent further damage. So a reflex arc, it's not really any different from the what we covered in the neurons tutorial, except that the message doesn't go up to the brain and then come back down and come out. It goes directly from the sensory to the interneuron onto this motor neuron, bypassing the brain, ensuring an immediate, quick response. I've uploaded another YouTube clip to this playlist. It's not one I made, but there's a lovely little sort of claymation video. Got some funky music in the background too, so check that one out. Quickly explaining what a reflex arc is. Looks a little bit like this. Alright, so just to go through the steps one more time, you need to know these for your tests, so just the steps in a reflex arc or in a reflex action. Okay, so the first one, stimulus, so something, usually a very strong stimulus, something's telling us that something's causing damage to our body. Alright, an electrical impulse goes down a sensory neuron, so this is part of the peripheral nervous system. It reaches an interneuron or a relay neuron, which is part of the central nervous system, and is found usually in the spinal cord. And essentially here, they will send a signal up to the brain, but essentially that's just to let the brain know what's going on. It doesn't wait for a response from the brain. It passes the signal also straight onto a motor neuron. So a signal does actually go up to the brain, but it will probably only reach the brain after we've already responded, or there's no time to actually think about how we're going to respond. A message is sent straight through this motor neuron, which again is part of the peripheral nervous system, straight onto an effector, so something like a muscle which will contract and make us move away, preventing any kind of further damage. So really you just need to know the steps in a reflex arc, and just be aware that the purpose of it, the reason for a reflex arc is just so that Sometimes it's best to just move that part of the body away without actually having time to think about what we're doing. Our body does it automatically. Okay, guys, I hope you found that helpful. Nice little quick one. And check out the other funky video on a little claymation video showing a reflex arc.
The type of stimulus and how a sensory ending responds to that stimulus are dependent on the organization of the tissue and of the nerve endings. Some endings may respond to rapid stretch, some to slow sustained pressure, some to shear forces, and some to direct pressure. The resulting action potentials and the pattern and firing rate of those action potentials are directly related to the strength and the nature of the stimuli. Receptor sensitivity is the ability of a receptor to detect or discriminate a stimulus. Low sensitivity means that it takes a large stimulus to elicit a response from a receptor, or that small changes in stimulus strength are not detected. Receptor acuity is similar to sensitivity, but generally refers to the groups of receptors working together. Many receptors packed densely together, each with a small receptor field, enable a finer discrimination of stimuli rather than a few receptors with larger receptor fields. The visceroreceptors are found in the viscera and provide information on the physiological processes contributing to visceral awareness. Viscera, remember, are the internal organs in the main cavities of the body, especially those in the abdomen, such as the intestines. They provide central nervous system information about things like core temperature, the acid balance in the stomach, etc. External receptors, or exteroreceptors, are in the skin, and the membranes are exposed to the outside world. They provide information on things that happen outside of the body. They help us understand sensations, like tactile sensations like touch, pain, and temperature. And we also get information related to the exteroreceptors from the skin, in addition to the skin, the eyes, the ears, the tongue, and the nose. Proprioceptors are specific types of mechanoreceptors designed to detect movement within the musculoskeletal system, and as such, they play a vast role in motor behavior. Included in this category are very special receptors in the labyrinth of the inner ear called the labyrinthine or the vestibular receptors. These are designed to monitor and maintain posture and balance. All sensory endings provide feedback to the central nervous system, and most have other functions as well. Body awareness involves two components, somatosensory awareness and visceral awareness. Traditionally, visceroreceptors, skin receptors, and proprioceptors together have been grouped as somatoreceptors. But data has emerged that visceroreceptors are processed differently than others. For this reason, we use the term somatoreceptors and somatosensation to refer only to proprioception and sensation arriving from the skin and joint receptors. Visceroreceptors and somatoreceptors provide ongoing information to the central nervous system regarding the ongoing physiological functioning and health of our bodies, including pain. Because of this information, we are afforded both conscious and subconscious awareness of our bodies. Body awareness, has two components, visceral awareness and somatosensory awareness, also called kinesthesia, and both have implications for exercise and motor performance. Proprioceptors and somatoreceptors feeding information to the central nervous system on bodily movement, including the amount and direction of movement, rate of movement, movement change, and forces. This information is processed by the central nervous system, gives rise to kinesthesia, the conscious and subconscious awareness of body and limb positioning and movement in space. Proprioception and kinesthesia are not the same and should not be confused. In addition to providing movement feedback, proprioceptors directly or indirectly initiate skeletal muscle reflex actions, and because of their locations, some provide information regarding tissue homeostasis to the central nervous system. So to summarize, again, the body awareness involves two components, somatosensory awareness and visceral awareness. Both have implications for exercise and motor performance, and kinesthesia is the conscious and subconscious awareness of the body and limb positioning and movement in space. Okay, I just placed this little link to some terminology. Just if you're finding that you're getting lost with all of the terminology in this chapter, take a quick look at this. It'll give you a very simplified explanation of some of the terms that we're using. We've also seen this in a previous tutorial video earlier in the chapter. This is a diagram describing the reflex action, the reflex arc actually. Remember that in this position number 1 here, it's the first step in the process that was described to you earlier, where a sensory ending detects the stimulus. The sensory neuron then transmits that signal into the area of the interneurons here, where choices are made about where messaging goes, whether it goes to the brain or whether it's the message is sent back to the via the motor neuron to the effector organ, and then the response is made here. That integration center that happens in the spinal cord that encodes and relays the signal is the interneurons I was just talking about, and they go again in 2 directions, to the brain and back to the muscle for an immediate response. In the slide after this one, we will see the 5 components again in a bit bigger diagram, the 5 components of the reflex arc. So pay attention to that. Remember, not all reflexes cause muscle contraction. Some reflexes inhibit the target muscles, and some modify other reflex actions. In this illustration, we're able to see the stretch reflex and its relationship with the basic reflex workings. Let me activate that laser pointer again and point out some of the elements of this. The first thing we see is that the sensory ending in this case is the muscle spindle here, and the neurons that are sending the messaging to the spinal cord are the sensory neuron, and in particular the 1A afferent neuron here, sending messaging into the spinal cord for processing. The central information processing area is also referred to as the inhibitory interneurons, as we discussed before, and the result is the messaging that comes back to the muscles in order to help balance the movement that's required. These 2 alpha motor neurons are sending signals back to the effector organ, and in this case, it's the antagonist muscle, which helps regulate the speed and intensity of the contraction that's being processed in this particular case. And to get a better understanding of this, I would refer you to page 68 in your textbook, where a full explanation is available to you along with this diagram. In one of the previous tutorial videos, we saw the presenter described a YouTube claymation example of what he was talking about, and let's take a look at that now. Okay, this is an example of the closed loop motor control system by Schmidt and Lee. So you won't find this particular figure in your in your textbook. It gives a good example of the components and characteristics of a typical closed loop system. We see input here and stimulus identification, response selection, movement programming. We have a comparator that rolls back and makes sure that the decision being made is correct. But what we're going to focus on right now is the lower part of this in the context of the reflex arc that we've been discussing. Here, the M1 pathway is considered and referred to as the monosynaptic stretch reflex. And this loop is a relatively low level in the spinal cord, as we've seen in previous um, illustrations and in the videos as well. And because of that low level of spinal cord decision making where the interneurons hit, the responses often don't involve any conscious voluntary control. They are completely reflexive and involuntary, and usually result in a rapid response of the stimuli. The monosynaptic combined with multisynaptic, which is the M2 pathway here, and is when the signaling or messaging goes from the muscle uh, responses, which were seen in the M1, to the higher levels of the central nervous system. And there are two types of reflex mechanisms by which actions can be modified quickly and automatically, and ultimately these two pathways lead towards the achievement of the goal in maintaining the closed looped pattern. Several reflex-like processes account for connections leading towards goal achievement in a closed-loop manner without involving the information processing steps. In moving from the M1, M2 triggered reactions and M3, which is voluntary reaction time, these responses show systematically increased flexibility but decreased latency in the muscles. Muscle spindles are relatively large receptors located throughout a muscle, though generally concentrated in the muscle belly. The function of the muscle spindle is to detect muscle stretch and contraction characteristics in order to provide muscle function feedback to the central nervous system and to initiate a stretch reflex. Both of these functions are critical in the production of coordinated movement. The complexity of the spindle allows it to be sensitive to rapid stretch and long, slow, sustained stretches, stretch velocity, static position, and perhaps stretch force. What makes the spindle different from other sensory organs other than the eye is the ability of the central nervous system to control spindle function. The muscle spindle has tiny muscle fibers in it called intrafusal fibers, which the central nervous system can control by small motor neurons called gamma motor neurons. By contracting or relaxing these intrafusal fibers, the central nervous system can change the property of the muscle spindle to make it more sensitive to stretch by contracting the intrafusal fibers, or less sensitive to stretch by relaxing the intrafusal fibers. This is known as gamma bias or setting the reflex gain. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the functions of the stretch reflex. When the muscle spindle is activated, either by passive stretch or active contraction, it feeds information back to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, the sensory signal is routed via the monosynaptic connections to the motor units of the hominis muscle. These signals facilitate the motor units and, if strong enough, cause a stretch reflex response in the hominis muscle. The facilitation and reflex actions initiated by the muscle spindle are not as simple as most reflex arc diagrams illustrate, and we've shown a few of those diagrams, and there's another one here on the slide that you're looking at. Muscle spindle activity is ongoing and plays a direct and indirect role in almost every movement that we make. In some movements, the spindle reflex activity must be inhibited. During most stretch reflex actions, synergist muscles are also facilitated and antagonist muscles are inhibited through a process called reciprocal inhibition. On the contralateral limbs, there may be an opposite effect on the agonists inhibited and the antagonists facilitated, or even other distal effects. For example, spindle activity in the soleus may inhibit activity of the quadriceps. The strength of the spindle afferent discharge and any subsequent reflex actions are mediated by many peripheral and central factors. Peripheral muscle factors including the prior amount and type of muscle activity, that's called activation history, and muscle length are just a few of the factors that influence the mechanical and neural properties of the spindle, and thus how it responds to stretch and contraction. At the spinal cord, a complex neural circuitry is used to control the expression of the reflex and reciprocal inhibition. For example, if the ankle dorsiflexors are fatigued, then the strength of the reciprocal inhibition arising from the dorsiflexor spindle activity is increased, making it more difficult to produce a strong contraction of the soleus and gastrocnemius. Different tasks may alter the amount of reciprocal inhibition, such as hopping producing larger amounts of reciprocal inhibition in the soleus induced by a contraction of the tibialis anterior compared to walking and standing, even when the strength of the tibialis anterior contraction is the same. In the next slide, we're going to introduce another video talking about the muscle stretch reflex and specifically understanding the length-tension relationship in the involuntary muscular reflex.
In this video, I'm going to talk about the muscle stretch reflex. The nervous system performs many reflexes, and a reflex is a response to a stimulus that doesn't require the involvement of consciousness. All reflexes have two parts. The first part is called the afferent part. Afferent. And that involves bringing information about a stimulus into the central nervous system. So there'll be some sort of receptor somewhere in the body that can detect the stimulus, and then there'll be some sort of neuron that brings that information into the central nervous system. The other part of a reflex is called the efferent part of the reflex. Efferent, which carries information away from the central nervous system to cause a response somewhere in the periphery. So there will be some sort of neuron that'll carry that information away from the central nervous system out into the periphery to cause some sort of response. Now, some reflexes, like the muscle stretch reflex that I'm just about to describe, happen on the same side, so that the afferent part of the reflex brings information in from one side of the body, and the efferent part of the reflex brings information back to that same side of the body to cause the response. Other reflexes, particularly those up in the brainstem, have an afferent limb that comes in on one side, and then efferent responses that come out to both sides. So there's some variety for how the information travels in reflexes, depending on the reflex. One of the simplest reflexes that's a good example, and that happens to be one of the most medically useful, is called the muscle stretch reflex. Muscle stretch reflex. If a skeletal muscle, like in this drawing, here's a skeletal muscle in the arm, if this is rapidly stretched, the muscle stretch reflex will cause it to contract very quickly after it's stretched, presumably as a protective response to prevent injury to a muscle from being stretched too rapidly. But let's go over the one that happens around the knee, that's also called the knee jerk, because most of us are probably familiar with this one. Because a lot of us, when we're in our doctor's office, have had the experience where we're sitting in a chair. So here I've drawn a person, and we're looking at their right side, and here's their trunk and their leg. And if you're in the clinic, often your doctor will take a little rubber hammer, and they'll take that little rubber hammer and they'll hit you right below the kneecap. And to your surprise, when they hit you below the kneecap with a little rubber hammer, your leg will often kick out without you telling your leg to kick out. There's this involuntary response of the leg kicking out to the stimulus of the rubber hammer hitting you just below the kneecap. So why does this happen? Well, the place that your doctor is hitting you with a little rubber hammer is not actually in the kneecap itself, but it's in the tendon that's just below the kneecap. So let me draw that here in orange. And that tendon hooks onto the bones in the lower leg. And connected to the kneecap on the other side from the tendon is a large group of muscles in the front of the thigh. And when your doctor hits you in that tendon, it actually stretches this large group of muscles. Because for just a moment, the little rubber hammer bends this tendon, and that pulls on the kneecap like this, and that pulls on this muscle, and it stretches it. Now, it doesn't stretch it very far, but it does stretch it rapidly. And there are receptors in skeletal muscle that can detect muscle stretch. I'll just write a big R here to represent one of the receptors. And there are lots of these receptors spread out throughout all of the skeletal muscle in the body. And these receptors are called muscle spindles. Muscle spindles. And here's a drawing of a muscle spindle. So here's a skeletal muscle, and they've magnified this little receptor. And we won't go into the details, but there are these specialized little fibers inside the muscle spindle that get stretched when the rest of the muscle gets stretched. And then there are neuron axons that are wrapped around these special fibers that can detect that stretch of these fibers and send that information back into the central nervous system. So that these axons that are leaving the muscle spindle here will travel back through nerves of the peripheral nervous system, and then they'll enter either the spinal cord or the brainstem. And these are somatosensory neurons that tend to have their somas and ganglia close to the spinal cord or the brainstem. And since these are neurons carrying information into the central nervous system, we can call them afferent neurons, and they make up the afferent part of the muscle stretch reflex. Let me just write that out. That for the muscle stretch reflex, the afferent part are the somatosensory neurons. Somatosensory neurons. Inside the central nervous system, like here in the spinal cord, these somatosensory neurons carrying that muscle stretch information, that information about the stimulus, are going to form an excitatory synapse. So let me just draw a little plus sign here to represent an excitatory synapse with another neuron whose soma is in the central nervous system. And this neuron is going to send an axon out through nerves of the peripheral nervous system back to the same muscle that was stretched. And it's going to synapse on and excite skeletal muscle cells in that same muscle, causing the muscle to contract, causing the response. And the neurons that synapse on and control skeletal muscle cells are lower motor neurons. Lower motor neurons. And for the muscle stretch reflex, the lower motor neurons make up the efferent part of the reflex that causes the response of contraction of the muscle that was stretched. In the video where we went over the motor unit, we talked about lower motor neuron signs that can appear with abnormalities of the lower motor neurons, and we talked about hyporeflexia, meaning a decrease in the muscle stretch reflexes. And I think you could see why that would happen. If the lower motor neuron is not able to communicate with the muscle, then it can't tell it to contract in response to the stimulus of muscle stretch. But it turns out that you can also have diminished muscle stretch reflexes if there's a problem with these somatosensory neurons bringing information about the muscle stretch back to the lower motor neurons. So that if there's a problem with either the lower motor neurons or the somatosensory neurons, you can have a diminished muscle stretch reflex. And it turns out this is true for all reflexes. If there's a problem with either the afferent part of the reflex, bringing stimulus information into the central nervous system, or if there's a problem with the efferent part of the reflex, carrying response information out to the periphery, a problem with either the afferent or efferent part of a reflex can cause a diminished or lost reflex, because both parts have to be working for the reflex to occur. Now, one important thing to notice about reflexes is how all of this just occurs down here, in this case in the spinal cord, or it could occur in the brainstem if it was a brainstem reflex. But the higher parts of the nervous system, the cerebrum, where a lot of the higher functions of the nervous system, like cognition, emotion, and consciousness, they don't have to get involved for a reflex like this to occur. And this is the reason we say reflexes are responses to stimuli that don't require the involvement of consciousness, because the wiring tends to occur at these lower parts of the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system without having to involve the higher parts of the nervous system way up in the cerebrum. Now, this is all you need for the muscle stretch reflex, but there is another part to it that isn't necessary but does add something, because it turns out that while this muscle is contracting in response to the stretch of the muscle on the opposite side, in this example, the muscle on the back of the thigh that bends the knee when it contracts, this muscle actually relaxes. So while the muscle on the front of the thigh is contracting, the muscle on the back is relaxing. The way this occurs is that this same somatosensory neuron that's exciting the lower motor neuron back to the muscle that was stretched is also sending axon terminals to other neurons, and it's going to excite those neurons, so I'll draw a little plus sign. But these neurons are actually inhibitory neurons, so they're going to form a synapse that's inhibitory. So I'll draw a little minus sign to represent that they're inhibitory. And what they inhibit are lower motor neurons to the muscles on the opposite side. So these lower motor neurons would normally be exciting the muscles here in the back of the thigh that would cause the knee to bend. But when they're being inhibited by this other neuron, these lower motor neurons aren't exciting that muscle in the back of the thigh, so it relaxes. Now this isn't necessary for the reflex to occur. You just need the afferent and the efferent part of the reflex for it to occur. But because this muscle, when it's contracting, isn't fighting against this muscle in the back of the thigh since it's relaxing, that does increase the response. So there's more straightening of the leg at the knee and kicking outward. And a lot of the reflexes in the nervous system have some similarities to this sort of setup, where you can almost think of a balance between responses that the nervous system can choose from, and that the reflex tips the balance in favor of a response in one direction.
Vestibular receptors, known also as labyrinthine receptors, detect the movement of fluid contained in the labyrinth of the inner ear. We're talking about this section right here of the ear. Fluid movement is caused by the head and body movements relative to gravity and velocity and acceleration of head movements. They act as mini gyroscopes in the head, serving as major contributors, helping to maintain balance and equilibrium. The neck receptors are located in the joints, muscles, and ligaments of the neck and provide information on head and neck position. The neck receptors work in conjunction with the vestibular receptors to help maintain balance and equilibrium. Reflexes initiated by vestibular and neck systems are called righting reflexes because they help right one's orientation during falling and other non-upright positions. Righting involves reorienting the head and specific pattern of leg and arm reflex action to prevent or prepare for falling. In the next video, you're going to see extreme examples of righting in the cat video that you're about to see. It won't be your typical cat video that you may have seen on YouTube before.
Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome back to Smarter Every Day. So you've probably observed that cats almost always land on their feet. Today's question is why? Like most simple questions, there's a very complex answer. For instance, let me reword this question. How does a cat go from feet up to feet down in a falling reference frame without violating the conservation of angular momentum? Now, I've studied free-falling bodies, my own in fact, in several different environments, and once I get my angular rotation started in one direction, I can't stop it. Today, we're going to use a high-speed camera. We're not going to use Allie, because this is my daughter's cat. I don't want to hurt it. We're going to use a stunt cat. Let me introduce you to Gigi, the stunt cat. I'll just flip the video vertical and then motion track the cat. It's just going to take a lot more effort in post. We're going to try to do it in a way that doesn't make anybody mad. That's pretty hard to do. You got to drop a cat. Ready, Gigi? Good. Checking out the high-speed data there, Gigi? Okay, the first thing a cat does when it's falling is try to figure out which way is up. It does this either with the gyro in the ear or with its eyes. 3, 2. Ready to talk cat physics? Alright, so check out this footage I captured with the Phantom Miro while Gigi goes to get a drink of water. So here's what's interesting about this to me. If you'll notice at the beginning of the drop, the cat is not rotating. Halfway through the drop, the cat is rotating, and then at the very end, Gigi somehow stops rotating. Newton's first law says that an object at rest will stay at rest unless acted on by an external force. I see no external forces on this cat. So what's happening here? It's not making sense to me. Okay, so in order to really get the right data, we're gonna have to drop her 90 degrees out of phase. Ready, girl? This time, watch her tail. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so you think you figured it out? Check this out. You probably noticed that when the cat was falling, her tail was rotating in the direction opposite of where her body was rotating. What's interesting about that is that that's not how it works. In fact, even bobtail cats can do this. It's called the cat riding reflex. I'll prove it to you. I came across some video from the 60s when the Air Force was researching microgravity for future astronauts. Turns out they took some cats up on parabolic flights. He tries to rotate his tail to flip over, but it doesn't work. He just ends up nutating wildly. Then he does something interesting. He takes his back and he bends it. And when he bends his back and then creates motion, something interesting happens. Ah, now we're getting somewhere. So let me show you one more cat flip with the Miro and we'll figure this out.
Here goes.
Okay, the arched back ends up being pretty important. What he does is he divides his body up into two separate rotational axes that are tilted from one another. When he's released, he pulls his front paws in and does the ice skater trick. He decreases his moment of inertia in the front so he can spin fast up there. But in the back, he pushes his legs away from him, increasing his moment of inertia. So a really large twist in the front equals a really small twist in the back in the opposite direction, and the torques equal out. So as soon as he gets his front paws in under him, all he has to do is extend those legs back out to increase that moment of inertia and stop the front twist, and extend his back legs along that rear axis. That allows him to twist those around really fast, and then all he has to do is pull them back in under his body and then extend all four legs and brace for impact. So thank you for your attention. I hope you learned something pretty cool about cats. If you don't mind, woo! okay, I'm done. If you would, go check out your other cat videos after trying to catch Gigi. Woo! A little too rowdy. If you'd like to, click Gigi the cat to subscribe. We'd appreciate it. I hope you had a good one. And go get the ball. You gotta catch her first. I got it. You want it? Look. Very cool cat. She let us drop her hundreds of times. Or, you know, maybe just 5. Want your ball? Go get it! Click her if you want to subscribe. Oh! But right now we're playing fetch. Ready? Go get it! I'm Destin. You're getting smarter every day. Have a good one. There you go. There you go. You earned it. Let me explain why cats are wizards at physics. First of all, they have physiology working for them. They have no working clavicle like I do, and secondly, they have very flexible backbones. The talent needs a break. 30 centimeters or higher. Anything below that is unsafe. Not that we condone dropping cats. Come here. Come here. Come here. There you go. Come here. Come get in the catapult. 3, 2, 1. Oh, man.
Fluid movement in the circular structure of the labyrinthine system of the inner ear helps stimulate sensory endings. These endings detect rotational movements, head tilt, and acceleration in any direction. This figure shows the sensory outflow to various parts of the brain, including the cerebellum, or various parts of the body, including the cerebellum, the leg and arm motor neurons, neck motor neurons, and eye muscles. This figure, that can be found on page 75 of your textbook, describes some of the neck reflex action. For example, the backward extension of the neck produces an extension of the arm and legs, whereas the forward flexion of the neck produces just the opposite, flexion of the arms and legs. Rotation or tilting of the head to one side produces extension of the arms and legs on that side and flexion of the limbs on the contralateral side. In humans, the riding reflexes are mostly overridden during normal activity, but sometimes they can be brought out with a little bit of manipulation. One way is by eliciting the post-contraction after effect, also called the cone stem phenomena. The cone stem phenomena is an involuntary contraction that lingers after vigorous isometric contraction. Ongoing cortical and spinal facilitation are suggested to be the reason for the ongoing contraction. The phenomenon is most often elicited by standing with the arms down at the side and pressing out, abduction, with a high effort on both arms against an immovable object for about 30 seconds. This is easy to do by standing in a corner or in a narrow doorway. Give it a try. And if you want some incentive, watch these two kids on the next slide. They're having lots of fun showing you exactly what they mean by the cone stem phenomena.
Cookie user here. I'm going to show you a little magic trick. It's where you put your arms in a doorway for about 30 seconds and your arms will just float up. You can't control them or anything. Just goes. So basically,
You hold it for 1 minute.
yeah, you put your arms like this. You just push like you're pushing out.
You're pushing your feet, like your hand should burn, like really bad.
Like you're pushing out like that, but really hard for.
Okay, now show them the magic trick. So,
like 60
you
seconds.
guys, if you've seen this, you guys should go in your doorway and do this.
I feel it burn.
2, 3, 4, 45.
It hasn't been a minute. You're counting too fast.
No, I'm not. 49, 50, 51, 52.
Okay, now watch. Good.
See, his arms are coming
I'm
up.
not even controlling it.
As you can see,
Ow.
you cannot control it. It
Like,
just goes
you
up
not,
right away.
Like, believe me, but you should really try it. You go to your door and just push on it, and your arms will just like float up.
Float up. It's amazing.
It feels cool, but your arms will hurt after a while.
Yeah. His mom taught him. So.
Yep.
See you guys.